That's really great. It's 10 a.m. I think there are a few more people that were listed to come in. They may come, or they may have decided that coffee is the better path to valor on a Saturday morning. But it's lovely to see you all. I think I'm going to start. Is that okay? So this is our Going Deeper forum. And we're starting a kind of a bit of a process of conversation, but we want to start this conversation with people in the congregation that were interested enough to come on a Saturday morning. Although we're going to record this, so you will be recorded if you're in the room, and if the camera's going in that direction, just to let you know. We want to record it so that we can share it with people more widely afterwards, and they can hear the presentation that Peter makes as we go, okay? Do I have to do any other housekeeping? The emergency exits are here and here.
Restrooms down the hall.
Please put your own mask on first before helping anybody else. I think I'm done. So I'm going to introduce people as we get into the presentation. So we're going to bring the presentation up on the screen. And thank you, Kenny, for being tech support. Peter, for your purposes, Kenny is here, and I think you know Kenny. He's doing tech support, and he'll advance slides as you request them. Okay?
Fabulous. Hi, Kenny.
Hey,
Hey, Peter. Right, you ready?
yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
Yay! So liturgical space going deeper, and I am here presenting. Dean Peter Elliott is presenting. Thomas Roach is also, who is Peter's partner and a liturgical artist in his own right. I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit in a moment. We're just adjusting the little side screen. I think that's okay, Kenny. I think it's okay. So let's go to the first slide. And I want to remind you that this whole program is a part of our strategic plan we're working on. And the next slide just focuses down on the goal that we're fulfilling. I think there was another slide. Maybe it didn't work. Okay. The fifth goal, which is working on a master plan for the building and working on a funding plan for that. So we're talking about liturgical space and going deeper. And I have some questions that I'm proposing to you by way of my introduction. And it's big kind of questions, like, what does being a cathedral mean to you? This is a rhetorical question. I'm not asking for an answer right now, but if you come up with an answer and you have one by the end of the presentation, when we get to question and answers, you can suggest it. I like this image. Some people think of a cathedral as a museum because it preserves all of the things from ancient history of the church, kind of like a museum does. I prefer to think of it as a laboratory, a place where we try new things and where we are leading and experimenting and exploring with the way that worship is going in the future. And we also do preserve some of the traditions of the past. So my next question is this: what's God calling the cathedral to do and be in the future? Another big rhetorical question. What is our job here in Sacramento? What is our purpose for being here? And then the next question: how could a reconfigured space strengthen and reflect our vision? Another big question, the answer to which I do not have yet. And a conversation with you is an important part of that process of discerning that. And we're really in a process of discernment, which is something that Leslie, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, has invited us to. As we think about our space, we really need to discern what our mission purpose is and how our space fulfills that mission and purpose moving forward. And we don't have the exact answers, but we're going to be developing them over the next period of time. Okay, the next slide. People who are helping us with this. I'm so grateful for people to help. So who's the first set? Dean Peter Elliott and Thomas Roach, liturgical artists. They're consulting with us on liturgical space and our vision. Can we perhaps call them up? Well, that might be complicated.
What do you want, Matthew? We're happy to talk.
I'm just gonna get you guys to appear on our screen.
Oh, I'm waving.
There we go.
There's Peter. And where's Thomas? And there's Thomas. Do you want to say anything by way of introduction? Just say hi.
Hello again, and great to be with Matthew and Leslie, who we've known for a good number of years, and Kenny, who we knew when he lived in Vancouver. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to be with Matthew and a group from Trinity Cathedral Sacramento. A few weeks ago, we did at a Dean's Forum. I did a brief presentation. We're going to do a little recapitulation, but add in some other themes and go a little deeper today as Matthew's title. I'm really thrilled that my husband, Thomas Roach, who is a liturgical artist and worked with me and others at Christ Church Cathedral in Vancouver when we went through the renovation process, is going to be here, and I'll let him say something about himself and get his voice heard.
Thomas.
So, hi, I'm Thomas Roach. I'm a textile artist, and my focuses on work are liturgical work. So I do vestments and hangings for churches on commission. I have a practice of spiritually based textiles that I exhibit in galleries around the country, and I do community art projects. But my time at the cathedral when Peter was the dean in Vancouver, a lot of it was around how liturgy was using the space, and I thought a lot about how spaces are used. I have a background in theater as well, so the connections between theater and church in terms of how space is used is what I'm interested in.
Thank you, Thomas. What's our next bullet point? Timotheus, our architect, is right here, and he came and joined us. Tim, you might not know Tim, but do you want to say hi?
Oh, good morning. Yeah, pleasure to be here, and to hear all the esteemed guests that we have on this presentation. My role is really to listen and observe today and hear what is going on in the minds of the congregation. So I'm happy to be here.
We're really grateful you're here, Tim. And then the last bullet, Leslie Pendleton is a capital campaign advisor that the vestry and I are working with to discern where we are going with possibly funding any kind of building project that might come up. And we are in the earliest possible phase of that process. We do not have a plan yet. We are in discernment, which is a wonderful churchy word that I love, which means trying to figure out what we're doing. Leslie, would you like to say hi?
Sure. Hi. Good to see all of you here. I just wanted to calm your fears, if there are any, so that you may calm other fears. We are nowhere near asking for any pledges or any money or any commitment to anything, because we don't know what that is yet. Discernment is part of our capital campaign process. There are 3 phases. We do discernment, which is listen and communicate and figure out where we're going and the big why. And then we go into feasibility study to test out projects, to get more information, feedback from everybody. And then that informs, that informs our ability to carry out a capital campaign and what those projects, what'll be included in that. I'm a former Dean Arena. I'm all the way over here in the far east in New Hampshire. My husband was the dean of the cathedral in Hartford, so that's how we all go back to ground zero, it seems. But love working with you remotely so far, and I look forward to seeing you. And it's a great pleasure to be partnering with Peter, because this is my discernment and his work sort of overlap. So he'll take the lead on the visioning here, and it'll still move us along in our process for the capital campaign.
And Leslie is again here as a listener today. She wants to listen to what we're saying. Okay? So I think we can go to the next slide, and I can hand over to Peter and Thomas.
Thanks very much, Matthew, and hello again, everybody. Our purpose this morning with you is to share some thoughts, some images, some ideas. We're not here to tell you what to do. What we want to do, Thomas and me this morning, is to generate a conversation amongst you, because it will be your vision that will propel you forward as you look at your liturgical space with an eye to reimagining it. As I said last time I was with you, we were involved in an extensive process at Christ Church Cathedral in Vancouver, which I was delighted that many of you had visited. Since my retirement at the end of 2019, Thomas and I have been working. You're now the 7th congregation that we've talked to about liturgical space. Not trying to in any way impose our ideas, but wanting to stimulate your imaginations, your thinking, your conversations with each other that are part of the discernment of what needs to be done. We think that designing space is actually a theological process. And I think as I've been talking to your Dean Matthew, I know that Tim, also your architect, understands that he needs to move very sensitively as an architect and designer to help the building do what it is that you want to do to express the good news of God in Christ. So Kenny, the next slide. So you're involved in a theological process, and theology, it's a big word. It really means anything we do or say to conceptualize our religious experience, our furthest vision, and our deepest aspirations. We can go to the next slide. I think this one I had with you last time. We got a little picture of your website of you on probably a festival, it looks like. We tend to think that, okay, the church buildings, some people think that church buildings are the house of God. Actually, no, the people are the house of God. Together, when we gather, then we are the living stones, as it says in 1 Peter, who make up the body of Christ as we gather at Eucharist for prayer, for community, and to be commissioned for God's work in the world. So let's go to the next slide. What I want to really focus on in the first part of the next slide, today's presentation, is mission. And what is the mission that we are called to do? Why is it that the church gathers? What is the work that we're called to do? So let's go to the next slide. Mission has changed over the years. I'm 70 years old this year. So in my lifetime, and probably in many of yours, are thinking about mission. And if you want to figure out how mission has changed, look in your hymn books for some of the old mission hymns. I love some of the old mission hymns, but oh my God, they have a way of expressing what it is that the church is about. It was, and I was taught in Sunday school, what the church seeks to do is to make Christians so that we can convert the heathens. And you'll notice there's inverted commas around that. With that went colonialism, spread Western culture around the world. In Canada, that really had to do, when we talked about mission, we always talked about it overseas and in the North. Overseas meant largely the African continent. The North meant largely indigenous communities. And so there's this intertwining of mission with colonialism. And the church had missions that it promoted, funded. When I was growing up, the women's groups put together what they called bales, which were these hampers of clothes and things which were sent up to indigenous communities. And the mission of the church was to make those, in quotes, heathen people into good Christians. Let's look at the next slide. Things changed. Things changed over, particularly after the Second World War. The Second World War was a moment of conscience raising in the life of the church, particularly why so many Christian churches were silent in the face of the Third Reich and the Holocaust. There was a big seminal meeting of the World Council of Churches, the first meeting of the World Council of Churches in Amsterdam in 1948. My dad was there. He was a youth delegate from Canada. Karl Barth addressed that group, and they began to look at how the church needed not so much to seeing people as heathens to be converted as needing to proclaim God's justice and reconciliation and good news to people who were hurting, and with a particular attention to those who were on the margins. There were a bunch of Roman Catholic observers at the First World Council of Churches meeting in 1948. They went back to the Vatican, and by 1963, Pope John the 23rd convened a council, a Vatican Council, which adopted a similar kind of theology. And one last thought, sorry. There was emerging a vision of a global kind of Christianity, the mission of the church all working together in the same way. Then some other things happened. Let's look at the third slide. Around 1980, it's hard to know, secularization of Western culture, reality of interfaith, the interfaith reality that our neighbors were not all Christians. I grew up in a Christian town. There were a couple Jews, but that was kind of it. Immigration patterns, certainly in Canada, I believe in the United States too, meant that our neighbors weren't necessarily Christians. In fact, they came from other religious traditions, and the growth of secularism meant that the church's proclamation about converting the heathen no longer was resonant. The movement that happened, and this is called missiology, was to move from the church's missions to the mission of God. In other words, what is God up to in the world, and how can we be part of it? Let's look at the next slide, which I think sort of says it really simply. It isn't so much that the church has a mission as God's mission. One God seeking to restore all people to unity in Christ, peace, care of the earth, the dignity of every human being, the things we promise in our baptismal covenant are things that are greater than the church, but that the church needs to embrace. The restoration, reconciliation, a big word in the Canadian culture these days, given the sad history of residential schools with Indigenous people. We're seeking in every part of our life to find ways to reconcile people to one another, and the church has a role in all of that. In fact, the agents of that work are the baptized, not so much the clergy, but the baptized in our daily life and work. So let's go to the next slide. I hope I'm not going too fast, putting a lot of things out here, but just want to get some content. So when we look at church buildings these days, the theology, when I said that defining liturgical space, a theological task, the theology is around participation. It's around participation. So let's go to the next slide. In the liturgy, what is it that we do? Think about your Sunday mornings at Trinity in Sacramento, Trinity Cathedral in Sacramento. We give thanks and praise to God. We bless God. We turn our minds and hearts to God. We hear from Holy Scripture and hear that Holy Scripture interpreted in sermons. We share in Eucharist, bread and wine, to empower us to be instruments of God's love and justice in the world. Occasionally, we welcome new members into the community through the sacrament of baptism. And then the most important moment of the liturgy, in my humble opinion, is when the deacon or lay assistant or the celebrant says, let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord. We are commissioned to go out into the world to be God's hands, feet, eyes, ears, healing presence in the world. We're commissioned for mission. So, in summary, let's look at the next slide. Every time we gather for liturgy, think of Sunday mornings. We are reminded that we are beings in relationship rather than creatures in ourselves. We are connected with each other It's really the most important thing. That we're called to participate. We're a gathered community, not an audience. This isn't something that somebody else is doing. We are engaged with this, and that we are a Eucharistic, which simply means a people who give thanks, with creativity and celebratory community. And we live not by pulling up ourselves by our own bootstraps, not by our own achievements. I mean, I was fond of saying at Christ Church Cathedral in Vancouver, they got tired of hearing me say it. None of us get out of this thing alive, okay? We are here only by the grace and goodness of God. And liturgy reminds us that we live by grace. Yeah, let's go on to the next. I think this is where Thomas takes over. He will increase and let me finish this slide and then over to Thomas. So my thesis is that liturgy is to inspire our participation in God's mission. It is to enable us to reach out beyond ourselves to the world. And it's in the world that we're called to live out the ways of God's kingdom in loving and just relationships. And now here's Thomas to pick it up.
All right, next slide, please, Kenny. So one of the things thinking about this conversation about participation, an observation for many of you who have spent time in theaters in your life for various purposes. Next slide, please. If you think about the classic, what's called a proscenium arch theater, it's really two rooms. There's a stage with a curtain, and something is happening up there. There's a bunch of actors and performers doing things, and the audience is largely sitting passively in rows, all facing the same direction, more or less, with you. The only view you have is the back of somebody's head and the view of the stage. Next slide, please. If you've ever been in a theater where there's a thrust stage, like this one, this is Bard on the Beach in Vancouver, Shakespeare Festival. And here the audience is around three sides of the stage. And it's a much more immediate connection between the audience and whatever's happening up on stage. And in fact, there are aisles and vomitoriums and ways to get in and out through the audience so that there's much more lively interaction between the two spaces. So this is a kind of a prevailing metaphor that we use in thinking about space. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you on a really whirlwind history through some points of the history of how church buildings have evolved. And this is really in the spirit of Matthew, thinking about church as laboratory. You'll see from these images that there is a whole history of things changing, things moving, changing, moving back to where they were before, maybe a variation on a theme. But I just wanted to highlight some of these things. So you can go to the next slide, Kenny. Thank you. So early Christian roots, before the church was established, the community met in people's homes, largely as guests of probably one of the more affluent members of the community. But church, those places weren't big enough for large community gatherings. And the key elements were, as they are still today, a place to share the word and a place for the Eucharist. But in a domestic space, that might have been two separate rooms. If any of you have been across to St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco, you'll realize that their space, it really is designed as two separate adjoining rooms, one for the word and one for the Eucharist. And we think about that as a table of a community gathered around for a community Eucharistic meal, as opposed to an altar of sacrifice, which is what will appear in later eras. And likely also in this time period, there would have been a separate space for baptisms. So if you go to the next slide. With the establishment of the church, the institutionalization of the church following Constantine's conversion to Christianity, the Roman Empire became Christian. And what happened is the Christian church adapted the basilica, which was the Roman and Byzantine form of public building. And here's an example of which, with a very large open space, a very high ceiling supported by colonnades on either side, and that apse, that curved space at the end of the room, was where the magister, or the person who presided over the public gathering, would have been. There might have been a bench around the outside edge if there were senators or other people sort of gathered in that kind of arc behind. When it was adapted at first for Christian worship, though, the place of proclamation and the place of the Eucharistic meal were probably not up there. They were probably down on the floor in the midst of the congregation, amidst the community gathered. Next slide, please. As we moved into the Romanesque, again, the church becomes even more and more hierarchical, more institutionalized. So that curved apse at the end becomes raised higher, it's bigger, and they move the table, which becomes a stone altar, reflective of altar of sacrifice, as opposed to a table for a community meal. And you get this notion of the congregation, the priest presiding on behalf of the congregation, and so that the priest faces away from the congregation with their back to the congregation, looking upward, sort of as the principal intercessor on behalf of the community. And so the altar often gets pushed right up against the far wall, the east wall. And it's in this period that apse becomes big enough to have maybe a choir, and the evolution of transepts or side aisles that create the cruciform shape of a lot of churches as we would know them today. Next slide, please, Kenny. In the Gothic, this is really seen by many as the kind of great heights, quite literally, of church building, and this sense of creating a grandiose space, a space that pointed upward, pointed arches, high windows, clerestory windows, a way of looking up towards God, creating this kind of sacred space. And it's in this period that the chancel area, apse and chancel area, becomes even more elaborate. And there's this kind of notion that people who might come forward for communion, come from the nave, but come into this kind of even more rarefied space and have a little taste of heaven, with the choir singing on either side, and that it's this kind of special place. And that's when we start to see rood screens and chancel screens, things breaking off that room to kind of separate the space even further. Next slide, please. So this conversation about rood screens and about where the altar is actually goes back and forth for quite a few years. So Thomas Cranmer, as part of the evolution of the Book of Common Prayer in the newly formed Church of England, suggests bringing that altar back down, and in some cases brings it right back down to the nave. By the 17th century, William Laud, in an effort to try and create this kind of uniformity, a kind of a unified vision of the church that balances the kind of more Catholic and the more Protestant forms of the church, sort of more or less puts the altar back at the east wall. And it's at this point that we really get what we now see as modern communion rails, largely introduced as a way to keep dogs out of the sanctuary. The notion of us eating, of us receiving, kneeling at an altar rail really develops following this period. This is not an ancient custom. It's old for us because it's 300 or 400 years old, but it's not an ancient tradition. Apparently, Christopher Wren, when designing St. Paul's Cathedral, London, even considered putting the altar center under the central dome at the crossing. So this conversation about where the altar is amidst the people or rarefied at the far end has been going on for centuries. And I'm not sure there's an answer. I'm not sure we're providing one. Next slide, please. But in our context, so the context of Christchurch Cathedral, Vancouver, which is a picture you see from the 1940s, 1950s, 40s in Vancouver, it's very much Gothic revival. So this return to what was seen as the Gothic ideal, very long, narrow spaces, high ceilings pointing to God kind of at the end in the distance beyond the east wall, with the altar flat against the east wall. And just because of the evolution of this was the style that was in vogue, both architecturally and theologically, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it's what carried through for a lot of church buildings in Western Canada and the Western US. And in fact, Trinity Cathedral in Sacramento is very much a sort of faux Gothic revival. It has that very long, narrow feeling, the sense of a presence and an apse at the end, with that little clerestory light that sort of points to God. So next slide, please. In the 20th century, beginning before reforms like the Second Vatican Council, there were lots of renewal ideas for the church that were exercised both across Protestant and Roman Catholic churches. And as Peter's highlighted some of those things, the full and active participation of all the baptized in liturgy, and a real recognition that people's involvement in the liturgy isn't about giving them jobs to do, but that the work of the liturgy is what the community gathers to do, and participation in that liturgy then gives them nourishment to go out and do God's mission in the world. So this is, it's about being engaged in the work in the church so that you're engaged in the work outside of the church. Next slide, please. And here, there we see the presider is celebrating in the midst of the community with the community gathered around. And it's not, one person at the end. I always think of a lot of Gothic revival churches as a Boeing 747 with the priest as the pilot at the front, and we're all in little rows facing the back of each other's heads, waiting for the pilot to take us somewhere, as opposed to this kind of sense of the community gathered around the table. Next slide, please. And this sense of the baptized community bringing baptism back into the center of public worship, not as it had been done for centuries of having baptisms in separate baptistries at private family events. The sense that the community is baptizing, and that very strong feeling that as we do that, we renew our own baptismal vows every time somebody is baptized. We're sprinkled with the water from the font. So the same, that connection, and that is designed to really give us the energy and the life to go out and do God's mission in the world. Next slide, please. So some liturgical principles, just thinking about some of the things that came out of our own conversations at Christchurch Cathedral, Vancouver. This is a picture of Christchurch Cathedral, Vancouver. Some principles that guided us. If you go to the next slide, please, Kenny. The church building makes a visual theological statement about who we are as a community and the purpose for which we gather on Sunday mornings and other times. So that's a key question. What kind of statement do we want to make? Next slide. So for us in Vancouver, this is a picture of you guys, but the sense of one room. And I picked this slide from your website, and this is an example of you're using the space as one room. The screen is forward of the chancel steps. Matthew and the congregation are all on one level, all in one space, and you're interacting without that separation between. So the sense of it being one room, that it's one place, there isn't a place where there are people who act and people who who sit and observe. Next slide, please. Within one room, 3 centers, and so this is a key part for what we designed at the Cathedral in Vancouver. The 3 principal centers: altar, font, and a place of speaking or proclamation. We call it an ambo. It's larger than a lectern. It isn't a pulpit. It isn't a separate place. There's one place of preaching and proclamation. And what it creates is this conversation and dialogue between the 2 principal sacraments of Eucharist and baptism, and the conversation between sacrament and word. And so that's really what we were on about in that space. So I'll hand it back to Peter to look at just one overview of the cathedral on the next slide.
Thanks, Thomas. I think you can see here, we got some images to share with you, one from Christ Church Cathedral. We've got some others. How we attempted in our own way to make that kind of more thrust stage that Thomas talked about, rather than the proscenium arch. You can see, I don't know whether my cursor, but a font, an altar, and an ambo, all of similar dimensions, similar materiality. We had them created for us by our architects and designers. And then a fair bit of open, empty space. And I'm saying those words very slowly because churches gather furniture pretty quickly around, furniture and ornaments, and in my view, often become kind of cluttered. And we did a fair bit of spring cleaning when we did the renovation at the cathedral to open it up. Why? So the people get to be the real decoration. The people with our different colored clothes, our different colored skins. We inhabit the space and it comes to life, as opposed to having a lot of ornaments around. And back to Thomas, I think, who has another picture to show you.
So the next slide. In the small world of things, this is actually the cathedral in Hartford, where Mark Pendleton Leslie's husband served. This is more recent than his time there. And this is an example of, on the left, you see a configuration. They've got a chancel that's very high, that wasn't possible for them to do many modifications to. So that they can have a kind of classic seating arrangement, but with the flexibility of chairs, they can also have, as you see on the right-hand side, a configuration where that conversation of word and sacrament is literal. They have an altar that is a table, that's similar to the cathedral in Vancouver's altar. When's the table not a table? And so their architect made the same decision our architect did, which was to put the legs in the middle of the sides as opposed to at the corners, somehow saying it's a table and yet it's not a table. It kind of distinguishes it. But it creates that dialogue between sacrament and word. If you look in the upper right, it's hard to see. There's a sort of a bright spot in wood just beyond the font there, and that's actually part of a ramp system that gets you from the nave floor level up to the chancel level. Yeah, just there, you can see where the arrow is there. And that's similar to what we did in Vancouver as well, which was to create ramps that allowed for complete accessibility, that there is no barrier to accessibility in any of the spaces. And that was a value that we had. We didn't realize how important that was going to be until suddenly people in wheelchairs were using it. And we were like, oh, build it and they will come. Next slide, Peter will take over.
Thanks, Thomas. This is from the Philadelphia Cathedral. And you might want to, as part of your exploration as a congregation, take a look at Hartford, take a look at Philadelphia. Philadelphia had this grand old building. They'd never had a cathedral. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, they reclaimed an old downtown church and with Richard Giles, whose book, Repitching the Moving Tent, does a deep dive into liturgical architecture and so forth, came as the dean. They emptied out all the space, and this is just one view. They built a space for baptism that has, as you can see, an immersion font and a sprinkling font next to the Paschal candle, and the community can gather around it. They also made a bench all around the perimeter of the Philadelphia Cathedral, with a bishop's chair at the center of it, in the chancel, and the clergy all sit around there when they gather for a diocesan event, with the laity sitting in chairs in the midst of the congregation. A very powerful image of the clergy surrounding the laity, the people of God, and empowering the laity, the people of God, for the work of mission. Back to Thomas. And the next slide.
And this is a parish in Calgary, St. Stephen's in Calgary. And just to say that this is kind of possible on a fairly small scale. So this is a parish that took out all of their pews, put a labyrinth down on their nave floor. And that's, you can see from the curve of that, that's almost the full length of that church. It's a bit longer, but it's a fairly narrow church space. And they were able to create a sense of community. The font, for some reason, has a fern in it. I'm not quite sure. An ambo in the middle, and then again similarly a table. And and they had a kind of stubby little historic chancel that has the wood paneling that you can see up there is actually from a previous incarnation of the church. This is a building that was built in the 1950s, but that had been preserved. And so they've kept it, but it just sort of kind of creates this surround, and it allows for a choir or musicians to be up there, or it's big enough for community space. Similarly, the cathedral in Vancouver, the chancel on its own is big enough for small gatherings. So small weddings and things could happen just in that space if it's all on one level and not divided by 17 different sets of stairs. And I think that takes us to the next slide, which is some questions and conversation.
Matthew, back to you to facilitate. But what we thought would be helpful would be for you maybe to turn your chairs, if that's possible, in the room you are, groups of about 5, no more than 5, smaller if you want to do it. And here's 4 questions to get a conversation going in your small group. Give the introverts a moment to breathe before extroverts jump in and start talking. You might, and if you're an introvert like me, you might want to make a little note on a piece of paper on your phone or whatever. As you think back over this presentation, and we've gone pretty quickly through history and so forth, what stood out for you in the presentation? Thinking about Trinity Cathedral, what does our space now say about who we are? And then engaging your imagination, what could our space say about who we want to become? And then further questions. And Matthew, I'll let you keep time. And our hope would be that we could hear a bit from your conversations, and Thomas and I will be here to respond as best we can to any questions you might have or any comments you might want to make. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Peter. I want to just say thank you to Peter and Thomas for a really rich presentation. I don't know if you're liturgy geeks like me, but I like this stuff. And I love looking at the history and why did it happen and why did that get put there and what happened, and it's great to look at the 2,000-year sweep of history, and also what are we doing now is a great question for me. So thank you for your presentation. Yay. We have another period of time, and I wonder if you might talk for 20 minutes in your small group, because we want some time for you to come and give feedback and ask questions of Peter and Thomas and me. and put them to us. If you want to, and you record in a little notebook or on your phone, any notes that we don't get to share altogether, then send them in to me so that I can compile them into a list of comments or questions. But we're going to leave this up on the screen, the questions, and then have you break into small groups for about 20 minutes. So we'll get back at 11:05, and then we'll have a little bit of a group conversation. Okay?
Okay.
Can you self-organize? Yeah. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome.
Do you want to walk amongst the people and check in with them?
I wish I could. I think let them have their conversations and we'll pick it up when they're done.
Yeah. See you in about 20 minutes. Hi, everyone. If I could have your attention again, that would be wonderful. Hi. I was just thinking some things as I wandered around and listened. There are lots of reactions, I know, to like thinking about changing space. I want to remind you or let you know that one of the purposes of having this gathering today is not just to talk about what we might do to the space, but as a part of our ongoing education about liturgy in the life of the cathedral. And that's one of the other goals of our strategic plan, to develop an understanding of what excellent liturgy looks like. So I really want to say thank you to our presenters for presenting about the history of liturgy so that we can be more informed about the way that space works, about the way that we relate to one another in the space. You may notice that we don't call the presider the celebrant anymore. And that's because of an underlying thing that I think one of you said, Peter or Thomas said in their presentation, which is our modern understanding that it is the entire congregation that is celebrating the Eucharist. The presider just presides over it. They're holding it. And like sometimes that word gets changed to president, and I don't like that. But we call it presider here, and we've consolidated around that word because we're recognizing that it is not the priest who is celebrating the Eucharist, it is all of the people that are celebrating the Eucharist, and the presider is just holding things together. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I also, a couple of things I was thinking, some of you have been mentioning that flexibility might be the key concept that we could coalesce around. And recognizing that, yes, we love exactly the way things are, and many of us, and have long-standing relationships to it. But actually, it does traditional worship very well. And I keep on getting asked for different kinds of space. The Centering Prayer wants to have a circle around the candle. The children's ministry would like to have more open space for the kids to be on the ground. There are different ways in which we can use space. And I want to remind you at the beginning, I sort of said, the church isn't a museum so much as a laboratory, a place to try things. And we can't try things if we don't have space to do so. So those are all important things. It also occurred to me that this conversation is happening in the historical context of the cathedral. In the 20 years ago, we talked about knocking the whole thing down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, that was the whole plan 20 years ago. We're not planning on that. Because of that, because that idea kind of has stayed with us for 20 years, there are some things that we haven't done that we maybe could have done, that we want to catch up with. Like just basic repairs, just like look after the space, fix the floor, and get rid of a legacy heating system that doesn't work anymore. So please think about that, but also think about the fact that we want to make a historic space work for the future. That's what's in my mind. And now I've said too much and I should just stop. But I wonder if anybody has any things that they want to say from the questions that we were asked, which includes what stood out to you in the presentation. Anybody want to throw something like that out at first?
We identified the labyrinth on the floor. We like the flexibility of having chairs and the thrust stage. There were two problems we identified, there was no acknowledgement or emphasis about the presence of music or the location of the choir. And also, there wasn't really much mention of things like to deal with age levels and disability, except talking about wheelchairs. Nothing about accommodating the deaf or the blind, and not a lot about the placement of children.
Thank you. I'm going to carry on gathering some thoughts together from people before I get Peter and Thomas to respond. Is that okay? Or to make comments? Any other groups, things they noticed from the presentation that jumped out at them? No? Yeah, Tina?
Well, one of the questions I had that was not addressed in there was the church is a final resting place for people, because we have a columbarium, and that's a big part of the architecture.
Yeah,
We mentioned that.
Columbarium, thank you. Anybody else things that stood out to them from the presentation? Yeah, Margie?
Really quickly, we have a lot of discussion about there not being an altar rail. We like the idea of the thrust stage, but we felt the need, well, I'd say there was definitely a lot of discussion of looking at some altar rails that can be removed, so you can convert the space. And one thing that really stood out in the conversation was, is someone gonna sit here in 100 years and figure out how to change the space again? And we thought, no, we would hope that some of the decisions we make are durable enough and that allow for reconfiguration in the future. And so I just thought that was really interesting. So I'm like, I hope not. I hope that, decisions actually stick.
I hear you. I actually have a different reaction to that, which is like, oh goodness, I hope so. And in 100 years' time, if they have a whole different set of questions and challenges, I hope that they do something. But also, I might hope that if we've chosen something that means that they can be flexible in the space, then they won't need to do quite as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There was a group here that hasn't commented that was like tucked in on the right-hand side, just the second group back. Anything about what jumped out at you from the presentation?
They summarized it really well.
Well, I would say that we did discuss the dedication of certain spaces. Now, we know about flexible furniture, we talked about the chairs and that release, but the dedication of a significant portion of space, we thought right at the entryway into the narthex. I didn't see any discussion of, all the pictures seem to be from there forward in the, and what's happening at the very back of the church, where we're trying to welcome people now and that sort of thing, what architectural, liturgical sort of intersection occurs there, as well as questions like, is there a permanent baptistry or Baptist area? I know we talk about movable font, but some people like the more permanent sort of setting that we have. So anyway, about the permanent spaces in the building, more so than just the.
And pointing out that actually is a screen, we screened off the narthex.
We did, yes.
Yeah.
And let me just make a comment on that. I had a couple of groups talking about crowded space in various places. It's crowded around the altar, particularly when you try and fit the choir, the musicians, the clergy, the altar servers, and everybody in that place. It's really crowded in the narthex as a circulation space when people are trying to come and go. And we don't necessarily have good flow in our space. But I want to pause for the moment and go back to Peter and Thomas and see, what did you pick up from those feedbacks and anything you want to say? And then we'll get some more feedback from you guys in a minute.
Sure, thanks for all that. And I'll kick off, and Thomas, I know we'll have other things to say.
Are you guys hearing okay?
Yeah, can you hear us okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay?
yeah. I just wanted to check that it was getting to you.
It's been really, really good, really good audibility. So yes, we are, for reasons of brevity, we didn't get into music. And that is a whole conversation. And certainly in Vancouver at the cathedral, that was a major piece. We, short answer, we basically moved the organ from the front to a newly constructed gallery at the back where the choir is, and that freed up all that chancel space. I don't think you're looking at that at Trinity, but we'd be happy in continuing conversations about places for musicians and the role of music. Yes, the comment about varying abilities. We did talk about wheelchairs and walkers. And I should say strollers around ramps. The strollers, I grew up in the 1950s. I mean, the strollers we had would probably be considered safety hazards these days, considered with these skookum strollers that families have. But that's been one of the things that the ramps have helped. but yeah, other varying abilities, physical challenges like the blind, the deaf, for example. A lot has to do, in my view, with sight lines in terms of the deaf. Again, in Vancouver at the cathedral, every principal service has ASL interpreters. So what's important is that deaf folks and some deaf-blind folks can be close enough to actually see what's going on. With visually impaired folks, with folks who have visual challenges, things like lighting, actually theatrical lighting, to improve spaces and that sort of thing. Then you have all sorts of other pieces there. The question about the columbarium, yes, that's a space that obviously our view was in Vancouver and with the other churches we've talked to, is think about the space as a whole and how it relates together. And that includes like welcoming space. Yes, all our pictures were looking forward. We have a number of slides. We have a number of presentations where we look at the importance of having community gathering space. That's more than enough for me. Thomas may have some things to add.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the whole theology of welcome is actually an important part of the conversation around what does the space feel like to somebody who is coming into it for the first time. And one of the things about the cathedral in Vancouver and its location is it's right in the downtown core, right at the center of the major intersection in the downtown. And having the doors open, visible, was a very important thing. But also open to the community, both by being open to the public for visitors, but also being open for community music and other community events, means that there were a lot of people whose experience of the church was at a secular event, at a non-religious event. And yet that the whole building was welcoming to them, and that they felt there was for a few years, we had a very active music festival that moved in and took over the cathedral for about 3 weeks in the summer. And so there were thousands and thousands of people who came through, discovered that it was a welcoming place, and then would stick their head in when it was open to the public. And having and then maybe some of them even came to church at some point. But I think that sense of welcome is an important part of that theology of who are you as a community and what does it say. I was working, just as an example, I was working with a congregation some years ago and talking about, well, what do you think about children in the community? And they were all excited. Well, we're very open and welcoming to children. And I said, well, so I walked into your narthex and there's a banner there that was clearly made with some love by a Sunday school group, maybe 30 years ago, out of burlap and felt. And it was a lovely thing. And they said, well, this says children are welcome. And I said, it says to somebody like me walking in, children were here 30 years ago and haven't been seen since. And the conversation continued, and I noticed the head of the altar guild slip out the back, whisk into the narthex, pull it down, whisk it off into the vestry, and look around for something else to put up there that would be more welcoming. So it's sometimes just looking at your space and what you're doing with a kind of fresh eyes. What would happen if somebody came in? What does it feel like to them? Does it feel one of the things that we as consultants do is give people permission, and one of the great permissions is get rid of the clutter. Sometimes you end up with more space if you can just get rid of things. We built in the narthex at the cathedral, we built a lot of cabinetry that is seamless into the walls, so that all the things that you need are there, but they're not visible all the time. And when they're needed, they're right at hand. And so there isn't clutter and junk, and it doesn't feel like you're walking into somebody's, bring and buy sale. A note about communion rails. Yes, there is a possibility of flexible communion rails that can come and go. We never actually did that. The cathedral community had a practice of standing to receive in lines down the center aisle. There had been a side chapel that was removed. There was a suggestion that we would bring a kneeling station back for Eucharist, and in our time there, we never were able to figure out a practical way to do that. That partly because that thrust platform, in order to be flexible at the cathedral in Vancouver, is actually modular and comes apart. So adding something to that was a difficult consideration. It's more or less never moved. It's only moved a couple of times in 15 years because it's too difficult to move. So that's the other consideration about things that are flexible. If you have a communion rail that comes out, you also have to know where it stores when it comes out. Where does it go? How easy, how many people does it take to move? How many people need to kneel at a station? Does it need to be big enough for 30 people to all kneel? Or is it a place that 4 people can kneel at? For those who want to receive, or 6 people, or whatever, for those who want to kneel to receive, and other people who have a different practice may receive at a standing station. So that's, I think that's, children. One of the great things in the pews versus chairs conversation about flexibility is that actually pews are family and kid friendly much more than chairs are. You can squeeze a family in. People want to sit cuddling up to each other or with toys or whatever. And that was why we also have kept them for heritage reasons, but we have a lot of the pews at the cathedral are around the perimeter. We took Richard Giles's notion from the cathedral in Philadelphia and put some of the existing pews around the perimeter, facing in. And so that allows for families, there's space, we left some spaces where they could park a stroller and then a whole family could pile into one of those pews. So that mixture of things. We also have an open space. That's Matthew's conversation note about just having that flexibility. Kids will go where they go, but it's good to have a place where they can land and to have, even to remove, we'd done this some years before, is remove a couple of pews, put down an area carpet, and put out some quiet things and coloring, Bible stories and that kind of stuff. Quiet activity, because a lot of kids, some of the kids these days don't want to go down or go to a separate Sunday school. They want to stay in church and kind of know what's going on around them, but they want to still keep something that they can have a quiet activity at. And that at the cathedral in Vancouver is actually right next to the main platform at the front on the right-hand side. And so the kids are, when they're sitting there, they can look up at the altar and there is nobody in between them and the altar. They're right there.
Thank you, Thomas. Some people are nodding in recognition because that's partly an experiment we've been trying recently to reestablish a family space where children can be in church, in worship, but occupied if they can't fully focus. And it's in the west transept. And around the west transept, the pews are lined around the outside of the wall, and families still like using them. And they're like, put a bag, put a kid's bag, have a child lay on a mum's lap, or and it's all kind of nice. And then there's all craft and activity there. I was also reminded of a story as you were talking, Thomas, about building things that are flexible and then not moving them. Everybody thinks if you build the flexible space, you won't ever move it once you put it all in. And that is a danger. I became the rector of Transfiguration in San Mateo after I'd had a massive flood and a complete rebuild of the interior space. I was not in any way involved in the liturgical discussion around how the space was going to be built. But they got a consultant and they decided they wanted to be flexible, to remove pews, to put chairs in that were flexible, and that they wanted to use them flexibly. So I arrived and they gave me their liturgical principles that they developed themselves with a consultant and said, we want all of these things. And I'm like, you mean that, right? I was like, yeah, we mean that. So I said, okay, I'm going to make you do that. So we moved chairs every 6 weeks for the first 2 years into different configurations. We designed 6 or 7 different configurations. And then eventually everyone got tired of moving the chairs quite that much. So we determined that there were 3 configurations that worked really well in different seasons of the year. And we would just move it seasonally. So we went from moving every 6 weeks to moving it maybe for Lent and Easter, maybe for the summer through to the fall, maybe for Advent through Christmas. And we would try, we never went for facing forward straight again. Nobody ever wanted that. If we faced forward at an angle or a curve. So there was a slight kind of circular nature to it. We would do what's called collegial style seating a few times in the year, which people liked, which was like everybody seated on the outside facing in. And we did that configuration that you showed in one of your pictures where the altar was at one end and the lectern was at another. Yeah. So the word spoke to the sacrament back and forth, which is a really nice idea. Except the radio mic didn't have enough distance to properly make that work. So we had to abandon that. You got to think about other technical things sometimes. And then we would do Eucharist in the round, which was actually quite popular with the altar right in the middle and all the chairs seated in a circle around it. That became quite popular. Sorry, I've been talking too much now. Popcorn responses, like individual responses. What does our space now say about who we are? I don't want a treatise or a kind of a long discussion, but what does it say now about who we are? Jess?
That we're a 1950s traditional church, and while churchy people might feel at home here, people who are less aggressively liturgically inclined might not.
Thank you. Somebody else?
That we have a hierarchical relationship between the clergy up high in front and the laity.
Thank you. Hierarchical relationship between the clergy and the laity, that we're a 1950s church that people that like that might like, but not everybody else might like.
Taking a cue from education where I work, my day job, we're very much a sage on stage, kind of a model, which is like I'm a teacher up here and you're my captive audience here. And it's shoebox design, so there's not a lot of flexibility there in our current configuration.
Thank you.
I like the screen blocking off the narthex as a way to keep extraneous noise out. And the other thing is having always, in the old days, sat in the back pew. Every time they opened the door, I froze.
But my question is, what does that configuration say about who we are now?
It says, maybe we should keep people warm.
Anybody else? Yeah?
Yeah, having the choir and organist up at the front of the church and not in a gallery in the back says they're part of the service too. And they're not just entertainers we've hired to tuck away and hear their sounds.
The visibility of the choir and the musicians
The choir feels like they're members of it.
states that they're part of the community. Great. Anybody else? So, next question, popcorn answers again, like just throw them out. What could our space say about who we want to become? What could our space say about who we want to become?
Well, welcoming and inclusive.
Welcoming and inclusive. That's the thing we might want to say.
Participatory.
Participatory.
Changing our, not just our space, but the world around us, our locale in Sacramento, changing ideas about who we are.
Allowing our space to shift our ideas about who we are in the church and in the community. Yeah, Margie?
Ever egalitarian, as evidenced by this discussion right here.
Egalitarian, that we are egalitarian.
I think, again, inclusive by whatever dimension you want, age or whatever.
The thing I'd like to say is that we like to try things. We're okay trying new things. Somebody else? Okay, I'm going to go back to Thomas and Peter and say, I just wanted to make sure that we had looked at all the questions you asked in our group conversations and see if you have any thoughts and comments on that. And I realize we've got to 11:30 already. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know, but like I am a liturgical geek and I have a lot of fun with this stuff. I love talking about this and we'll happily do it forever. But we did say 11:30, so Thomas and Peter, any comments you want to make about those last pieces of feedback?
Yeah, I just had one thought around the about the choir at the back. And so some of the conversations that we had at the cathedral in Vancouver around the choir being at the back was not about hiding them away, but was about the the choir being able to lead the congregation in the music of the liturgy, so that it becomes support for a singing congregation to have strong singers and the musician and the instrument behind you, so that the music comes up behind you and supports congregational singing. That's why we moved the organ to the back, to get away from this sense that that it is necessarily performance. One of the great things about then opening up the space by removing organ consoles and some of the and all the pipework and stuff was then, if we wanted to have the choir at the front, there was actually space for a concert piano and a 3-piece band and a 20-voice choir. There wouldn't have been space for that before, because there was so much other furniture with choir stalls. So the cathedral in Vancouver has a permanent place for the choir at the back, but they sing at the front on a regular basis, depending in large part on the repertoire. If they're doing classic Anglican choral music supported by organ, they're at the back. If they're doing Baroque with continuo, there's a little portatif at the front with a few strings, and so they can that mix of things to create that variety and flexibility with the music program.
We have lots of thoughts about music, so if you want to have another time to talk with choirs and musicians and all that sort of stuff, we'd love to be part of that, and we have a whole other presentation that goes around music. Again, not trying to sell, it's up to you, but stimulate conversation and identify values.
Peter, any final thoughts you want to add?
No, it's been really engaging, even though we're doing this electronically. I can see you, and it's wonderful and I think Leslie and I had a little chat. It was wonderful to experience the energy that seems to be in the room. I heard a number of groups saying the word 737, and I was smiling, thinking, yeah, once you've got the image of a church like a 737 Boeing plane, it's kind of always with you. So thanks, Thomas, for putting that in. Leslie might have some thoughts too. I'll just give the last word over to.
Well, Leslie and Tim, I guess. Leslie, what have you heard?
Well, it was I'm glad to have been invited to watch and hear. And again, this is this is all that D word, that discernment word, and figuring out, who you are as a community and how you want to reflect that. It's not easy. It's not a simply answered question. So I think you're off to a great start, and we'll continue the conversation and with Peter and Thomas's and certainly Dean Matthews' expertise.
Thank you. Tim, I wonder in the room what you were hearing, experiencing.
Well, I was really encouraged and excited to hear all the conversation about change and the openness to that, while recognizing yet that there is tradition that is represented here and how to balance that. So I echo Leslie's summary in that, it's in the middle of discernment, and it will be interesting to have those conversations as we actually look at the space and how to implement, that element.
Yeah, thank you. I'm winding down now, but I heard a number of things in the room. I heard some real love of some of our traditional space, some real love of some of the way that we move through the space and use it. A love, for instance, of kneeling to receive communion from some people and not so much from other people. But in the midst of all of that, everybody said, it seems like it, but could it be flexible? Like, yes, I'd like a kneeler to receive communion out, but could it be flexible? Or like, yes, I'd like this kind of chair, but could it be flexible? Like, and I don't know, I'm feeling that from the room, which is something that I believe would be good. But But I also want to say what next steps look like. We're not going to have a long series of these conversations. You have been here, we put it out to the congregation. We had a forum for the entire congregation. We put this out to you guys and you all wanted to come along on a Saturday morning. That means I think you really meant it. We're going to make a video of this. We're probably going to cut out the question answer section because that will all just be higgledy-piggledy noise. But we'll have the presentation at the beginning and the one room question and answer at the end. We'll keep that. We'll make that available to the congregation. We'll invite people to give feedback. But really the next step is to ask Peter and Thomas if they might talk to the building and tech team that are doing some deep work on this subject, and at some point talk to the vestry about decisions that we might make. And then when we need to, we'll be continuing our discernment with the wider congregation, with Leslie, about where we're going next. So there's some digestion that has to happen now as a part of the discernment process. Does that make sense? And I'm going to stay around for a little bit if anybody wants to come and ask me any questions or make any comments, but I want to draw us to a close if that's okay. And oh, it's a church service. No, not a church service, a church meeting. So we should probably end with a prayer. I don't know, I'm going to throw this at Peter. Peter, do you want to pray for us? You're a dean of the seminary.
It would be a joy. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for your hospitality and for your welcome. It's so good to be with you. May God be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks that as your people, we are gathered together to receive your power and your mercy and your compassion, gathered together to become your people who are instruments of your love and justice in the world. We thank you for the heritage of Trinity Cathedral, Sacramento, for Dean Matthew's leadership, for all who care about our life. We pray for the annual meeting tomorrow, that your Holy Spirit will surround it so that we may embrace the future to which you're calling us. And ask that you bless our homes and our families, those we love, and keep us mindful of your promise to be not afraid, because you are with us even to the end of the age. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
I will say tomorrow is the annual meeting. We were having this meeting today because we want to move this subject forward. This won't be a major discussion point at the annual meeting tomorrow because we've done it all today. We'll be talking about where we are in this process a little bit tomorrow. The annual reports are on the little side table just over there at the edge of the gallery. You can take one and read it overnight. Please don't come back tomorrow and take another one. They have limited numbers. Just bring yours back. But also, we won't be reading the annual report from the front. We'll be making a slide-based presentation on things going on in the life of the cathedral. That's at 4 p.m. tomorrow. Happy hour is at 5 p.m. if I get to the meeting on time. And then dinner is at 6 p.m. So many of you have volunteered to bring food in. It's really, really wonderful, and we're excited about that. Dean's awards have all been like set up and they're ready to go. So come along and see who gets a Dean's Award this year. Should be super, super fun. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.